Life was simpler, and the way those people chose their leaders, they sat in a forum or they sat somewhere, and the people got up and they spoke to them and they exposed their thinking, how the quality of the mind, people knew them by reputation and they could judge the quality of their ideas. Believe you me, nobody, no party has a hammerlock on all the good ideas that we're going to need to run the Republic. And I'm here to give you my ideas about things. The representative that we've elected and sent to Washington, D.C. to be our voice. And he could have made this. There's just 12,000 people in Hereford. He just didn't want to do it. I think the people in the 19th district need a real representative. And I'm glad that a lot of the panelists are actually Republican or conservative or have some other label other than Democrats. Because I can count on the Democrats. I don't have to say anything to them. I'll get those votes without doing much. What I want to do is talk to people who have a little different outlook on things. But you know, everything works right up to the day it quits working. And I think this, what we called a Republican philosophy and a conservative philosophy is wonderful. It's a beautiful word, fence, but the reality behind the word fence is pretty putrid and stinks, and we all know it. And we can continue to believe in it, or we can take a look at some alternatives and find some other ideas that will let us go forward and create the kind of world that we want to live in.
Thank you. Mr. Peterson, would you like to make your opening statement?
Sure. Well, I'm Chuck Peterson. I'm running for the Congress, District 19 also, as a Libertarian. And I'm running partially to give people a choice because a lot of people aren't happy with either Republicans or Democrats anymore. I'm also running because I've been disturbed lately by the fact that the government in Washington has kind of been ignoring everybody else in their lust for power. Things like the Patriot Act, which abuses the civil liberties of a lot of people. Things like bailing out their friends on Wall Street. Not worrying about the people in general. Things about not giving people, individuals, responsibility for their own lives and their own decisions, but instead trying to bail out anybody who made a bad decision. So as a Libertarian, I really feel that we need a sense of personal responsibility. And we need to have a government that does not abuse the principles established by our founding fathers when they established our Constitution. We've had a lot of loss of our constitutional liberties in the last few years. Every time there's a war on anything, we tend to lose some of our freedom because they scare us into giving up some of our freedom. So that I'm afraid that this idea of scaring us and then making us give up some of our freedoms that our forefathers died for is a process that's continuing, and that's why you need a Libertarian in Congress and a Libertarian viewpoint ascendant in the land, because the two major parties are just trying to get as much political power as they can to take advantage of the ordinary citizens. I also am running because I know some people are disturbed with our current congressman for various votes he's had, supporting Fannie and Freddie for one, or National ID Act for another, and I want people to have an alternative rather than vote for a Democrat. So it's a good thing that Dwight and I are debating that now. Dwight's a very personable guy. I have nothing against Dwight, but if he were elected to Congress, he'd have to support Nancy Pelosi, and I have a lot against her. She cheered the Colombian Free Trade Act, which was nothing but a pure gain for us, and would also encourage ties with the only country in Latin America that's relatively friendly. The tax policies that they're trying to put through Congress would reduce people's incentives to try to do well because they would tax the successful. As a business professor in the past, I talked to a lot of young people who wanted to do well. And, if you're going to say, well, I'm going to take half of what you earn if you succeed, and you're going to bear the whole cost of your failure if you lose, it kind of discourages entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is the principle upon which our country really was established to thrive, personal responsibility as well. So those are a couple of things. The Democrats in Congress, Obama and Nancy Pelosi, both have supported its Employee Free Choice Act, where they could have people sign a card for a union representation. And this would essentially mean that if no cards were signed, there would be no vote. You'd have a union. Right now, if you sign a card, you have a vote supervised by the National Labor Relations Board, and it's a secret vote. If you believe in democracy, you've got to believe in secret ballots. So obviously, the people supporting this act do not believe in democracy, and they're trying to empower their labor union friends, which is also not good for business. And I fear that if the Democrats take control of both the House and the White House, that we will have a lot of business leave our shores to more friendly business clients.
Thank you very much. Our first topic for tonight will be foreign policy. First question is Mr.
Yes. My question is, what should the United States do about recent Russian aggression? And what should we do to prevent further hostility with Russia?
Does that come to me? Oh, okay. It's pretty easy to understand what's going on in Russia. It's not so easy to like it. They missed the days when they were a world power. Almost, they thought, at least, equal to the United States. During all that Cold War era, they spent massively on armaments to the detriment of their general economy, and they lost that race, as Ronald Reagan explained when they were going to. Since then, they've gone through a difficult time trying to handle their economy. And, most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the problems in Russia, but they've now re-emerged on the world stage, mainly by being a little bit more bellicose and invading, for example, their separatist provinces in Georgia. The truth of the matter is, though, we're not on the brink of reigniting the Cold War. We're not going to be able to punish Russia, but the most effective we can have on Russia is through the economy, through trade sanctions and through access to credit and that sort of thing. They are not isolated. They are now a sitting. They have an observer who attends OPEC meetings, and they furnish Europe a lot of their energy. So they're not isolated at all. For us to begin to imagine that we need a Cold War scenario and start cracking the whip over Russia, that's not going to happen. That's not to say that we can't have a massive influence, mainly in the financial sector.
Mr. Peterson, your response?
Yeah, well, I don't have a whole lot to argue with. I do believe that one reason that Russia invaded Georgia was because they wanted to control the oil supply and the gas supply to Europe. Because Georgia has some pipelines that don't go through Russia that would allow Europeans to get oil and gas from the Caspian Sea without having to worry about Russia. And Russia wants to monopolize that because if they threaten to cut off the gas and oil supplies to Europe in the winter, Europe caves in because they're a bunch of wimps to begin with, but they also tend to cave in more easily because they don't want to freeze in the wintertime. So strategically, we have to try to keep the oil and gas pipelines open as an alternative, but we don't want to go to war with Russia. As a libertarian, I don't believe we need to go to war at all unless somebody is about to attack us or has attacked us. On the other hand, I think that we need to put some economic punishment on them. One reason they want to control the gas and oil pipelines is for their economic benefit because they produce a lot of oil and gas. And so we need to try to limit their access to the economy in the West to some extent in terms of the G8 membership, which would be insulting and also would deprive them of some economic opportunities as well. So I think we should use economic sanctions.
Thank you. Mr. Thornton, you have the second question?
My question to you is, what are the most important conditions for U.S. military interventionism around the world? Describe your view of both the legislative and the executive branches in this process.
In terms of the U.S. military, I mean, I think our military is great, but I don't think we should waste their lives and their bodies in fighting wars where we don't have a dog in the fight. And so, as a libertarian, I'm opposed to trying to be the world policeman and putting people into Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina and places like that. I think that given that Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction, we shouldn't have gone in. On the other hand, now that we're there, I think that we don't dare leave with our tail between our legs, and we don't dare leave chaos over there, because out of chaos it's going to grow a lot of people that use that as a place to come after us again. So I feel that we have to try to get a stable government before we pull out and leave. I don't think we can just arbitrarily say we're going home at any given point in time. It's a matter like fighting on the playground when you're a kid. You need to be willing to fight your fight to the conclusion, or you're going to get kicked on again. You turn tail and run, everybody else is going to come after you. So I think that once we get in a fight, we have to pursue it, but we should not get in a fight where we don't have a dog in the fight, and that means we shouldn't have been in Iraq, and we shouldn't have been we shouldn't go into Somalia, we shouldn't go into a lot of other places. Black Hawk Down was truly an embarrassment to us because we didn't go in with full force. If we go in, we should go in to defend ourselves. And we should go in and do the job and not let Osama bin Laden sneak off Pakistan's Northwest Territories, for instance.
The American experience was built on our colonial experience. The thrust of your question has also, as well as the Iraq War at its core, it also had a component which has to do with the institutions of government, the Congress and the chief executive. The governor general that exercised executive power in most of the colonial era was a representative of the monarchy in England. And we have a very unusual situation in this country where our president is also commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And this has always been something of a problem because he has to get his money waging war from the Congress, but he's the one who orders the troops into action. This got us into trouble in Iraq, and we need a Congress which is a little more assertive and makes certain that we don't get into another one of these shoot first and ask questions later situations like we did in Iraq.
Thank you. Mr. Serrano has a final question on foreign policy.
This question is much along the same lines as the last, but it's a little bit more specific. As you both know, Iran has become an increasing threat to the United States and its allies over the past few years. If Iran continues to threaten our allies, such as Israel, in an attempt to advance their own nuclear program, would you support legislation to strike Iran with our military force? That goes to you first, Mr. Fullingim. I'm sorry, would you support legislation to strike Iran with our military force?
Well, I don't think it would be legislation first. If the executive branch would come to us with a recommendation. And certainly, that's one thing I'm proudest of Obama for. He's very, very forthright and direct about the need to contain Iran's ambition. I know that country from the 15 years I spent in Saudi Arabia. It's just across the pond. We read their daily news almost like we read the things going on in Dallas or Houston. And what most people don't know is the Iranian population is very much pro-American. It's always been their leaders who are, especially since the mullahs took over, who've been very bellicose and threatening to the United States and to Israel. But I agree with Obama. We need to stop them, and we've taken our eye off the objective. And we can do that. We've done that with countries all over the world. It'll be almost a Cold War-like situation, but we can control that situation. I believe we can.
Dwight raised a good point, is that a lot of the population is not very happy with the mullahs in Iran. There are a lot of young people there, and I think that we should not go into another military adventure. Again, I'm libertarian. I don't believe you go in unless they're going to attack you. But I do believe we can put economic pressure on them. For 5 years, the Europeans have negotiated with them and accomplished nothing. So I don't think it would really help a whole lot if they negotiated with Obama too. But the problem is we need to get some backbone from the Europeans. We need to have effective sanctions. You know, one of the things in Iran is they don't produce enough of their own gasoline. You know, if we could get some sort of an organized embargo on our gasoline imports, getting the other countries in the free world to go along, I think the dissatisfied youth of that country might rise up against their rules, or at the very least, vote out Ahmadinejad's job and try to get a more friendly group in. Also, the businessmen are really hamstrung in their ability to do business in the West because of the sanctions we've imposed already, and if the Europeans were to tighten their sanctions, I think that would help as well. But we need cooperation with the Europeans is the most important thing.
And now we will transition over to the topic of energy. We will start with Mr. Foreman.
Thank you. Gentlemen, the 19th Congressional District is located on land which has been referred to as the Saudi Arabia of wind energy. What would you do, if anything, to encourage wind energy that may potentially be distributed over vast regions of the country?
Well, wind energy is very good, and we can produce wind. It's not as cheap as natural gas. There are a couple of problems with wind. Number one, if the wind doesn't always blow, so if you're going to have something depending on wind energy, you also have to have backup power with equal amounts of kilowatt production capacity, because you don't want to have your factories grind to close in the middle of the day and all your computers go off because the wind decided to take a hike. So that's one of the problems. Another problem is it's fairly costly and expensive. One reason it's fairly costly, though, is that it doesn't have transmission lines, and that's one thing that Boone Pickens has been trying to get. If you could hook up the transmission lines, which would be an appropriate part of the infrastructure for government to do, just like roads, that might be a suitable thing to do. Also, Texas Tech has a wind power research center, and I know the director of that, he's a very sharp guy. Funding for that wind power research would be great because it could bring the cost of production down and encourage people to use wind power without subsidies, which in the long run, as a libertarian, I hope it becomes cost effective without subsidies.
I'm so glad you asked that question. Whenever I go down to Abilene, I pass the land of the giant wind turbines down around Snyder and all the way around. Then up here in Floyd County and Hale County, if you could look at a satellite map of the world, and particularly our part of the world, and have an indication of what were the hot spots for wind, this would be the prime location on this planet for wind power. And Chip is right, there are two reasons why wind turbines wouldn't be turning. Either the wind's not blowing, or there's nobody to sell it to. Those are the only two reasons they wouldn't be turning all the time. So when you see one in the title, that's the reason. The representative that we've elected and sent to Washington, D.C. has unbelievably voted against wind energy and the production tax credit, which it's going to take to make that energy source come to life. He voted against it every time he had a chance. He's absolutely in the pockets of other special interests and has turned his back on the one that is right here in the 19th district. That's outrageous and unacceptable. When you send Dwight Fullingim to Washington, you can be sure that I'll push for a 20-year production tax credit on a declining basis, so it starts off at 2 cents a kilowatt hour and tapers off to a tenth of a penny after 20 years. You don't need to be in it forever. But for sure, we're in it, and our people will benefit mightily from having wind energy. It creates good jobs. We can sell that energy to the grid. I saw a map the other day of the current grid and the extension plans of the grid, and our people can receive good economic benefits from wind power.
Our next question comes from Mr. Serrano.
First of all, do you agree with drilling offshore for more oil? And since drilling for oil only poses a short-term solution to the energy crisis that our nation is facing, what current solutions to the problem do you see as being beneficial to the 19th Congressional District and the country at large?
Good. Well, I spent 30 years in that business, several of which were spent in the drilling business. And what I know is that you can drill anywhere, and you can do so in an environmentally safe manner and safeguard your environment. They don't even throw the chicken fat from the kitchen galley overboard. They don't throw a paper cup over the side of an offshore drilling rig. They put a blowout preventer in the hole to keep it from blowing the drill stem out of the hole, and they send a pig through the pipeline that x-rays the walls of that pipe and can find a pinhole. So we can do that and get any amount of oil. However, I hate to inform you, the age of oil is over. It's not apparent to everybody. It will be within the next few years. Remember, the Stone Age didn't end because they ran out of stones. And the age of oil is not going to end because they ran out of oil. But we're going to find another technological solution. We're going to find something else to put under the hood of your automobile that won't cost you $70 to fill up. That you can't bear that, you can't stand that, the United States can't stand it. It's going to take an Apollo-like program to handle that, and we've got to afford it. Whether you think we can or whether you think we can't, we've got to get loose from foreign oil. I worked 15 years in Saudi Arabia, and they've got lots of oil, but they don't have it. We can't pay for that on and on and on at the prices we're now having to pay.
Well, I agree with Dwight that offshore drilling can be done without ruining the environment, and I think it should be done. I think we should pursue energy resources wherever we can. And I think that would include also trying to increase the production of existing fields, because presently, fields tend to play out when you've had half or a third depletion, because it's hard to get the secondary and tertiary recovery, and it's costly. I would really like to see us, instead of taking money to buy foreign oil and putting it down a hole in Louisiana or Texas where we don't even know if we can get it back up, called the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which has already been documented as having bad pumps, to have the government instead use that money to buy up some of the oil fields around West Texas that have had the primary depletion, and fit them up for secondary or tertiary depletion, because they could then be used whenever we had a crisis. It would encourage the government to fund research in secondary and tertiary production, which of course tech would be very good at doing. And it would also be something that I would think in the long run would help us produce more oil when we needed it. The problem with substitutes for oil is that you need a compact source of energy that you can carry around with you, and that's oil and natural gas are among the limited ways you can do that. One other thing we could do is to encourage the production of clean diesel fuel from coal. If you do that, you get rid of the sulfur and the mercury and the other bad stuff in coal, and the only thing you have to worry about is carbon dioxide, which in a way I'm not worried about, because we've had a lot more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in the past, and it really hasn't hurt the planet. Just don't buy oceanfront property. So I encourage people to take drilling and energy development wherever you can, and that would include offshore, and/or, and any other type of substitute, coal, oil shale, etc.
Thank you. Mr. Green?
Yes, what would you do to support and encourage the utilization of domestic oil supplies? Domestic oil supplies.
I think I just answered a lot of that. I basically think that we ought to go ahead and let people produce the oil when it's economic to do so. And I think if we're going to have a strategic petroleum reserve, less the Mideast flow up, and we need to be able to get oil from somewhere else, that we have fit out the key fields for secondary and tertiary recovery in the depleted oil fields, so that they would have production capacity. They're tied in with pipelines and distribution systems, and it'd be a lot better to have the production from existing fields than trying to pump it up from Louisiana and finding the pumps didn't work. I've had some problems with those in the past. Or finding the oil was low grade because it had been bought by a government employee who was maybe getting paid off when they put it down the hole.
Oh, sure.
Well, I've heard that.
Oh, yes. Domestic oil production, and what I would do to stimulate it, if that's the question. Well, that's interesting, because I spent 15 years in Saudi Arabia, where the pipelines are this big around, where the tanks hold 2 and 3 million barrels apiece, and there are tank farms that have dozens and dozens of giant. It's all land of the giant stuff, land of the giants type stuff in the Middle East. This is little bitty rinky-dink stuff with a little pipe about that big around, a little tank about the size of a little water tower or something like that. If anybody imagines we're going to make the United States energy independent by drilling for oil in the United States, I think you've got something coming, because you're not. There may be in the Rocky Mountains, you know, these continents collide and throw the mountains up in the air. There could have been an ancient seabed somewhere up in the mountains. How you find where to drill and how you do that, nobody's been able to figure out yet. And this oil that's in the ground that's looks like black toothpaste or something like that, and you're going to turn that into gasoline. That's wonderful, but I don't know what you're going to do to it. Heat it, boil it, smash it, knead it, or you're not going to get from point A to point B with more domestic United States production. You'll get some, and you should get all you can. But if you're putting your long-range hope in that, you're going to be disappointed.
Thank you. We will now move our attention to environmental issues. Mr. Strong, you have the first question.
Mr. Peterson, you kind of touched on this in the last answer. Sorry for the redundancy, but would you support legislation to drill in the Alaskan National Wildlife Refuge? Why or why not?
You want me to go first on this thing?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I believe we should drill in a wildlife refuge. I think there's a lot of oil up there. You can put down a pipe and you do horizontal drilling and it could reach a whole lot of that oil without putting a big footprint on the planet. And I'm not so sure that, now we know that the caribou don't mind because they continue to bloom and grow and thrive in on the North Slope, even though we've been drilling there. So I'm not sure why there's such a resistance against that. Other than it's just symbolic that, you know, we should save the environment by not drilling. But we need the oil. There's a lot of oil there. There's not only that, but there's a lot of oil underneath the Arctic Sea and a lot of natural gas under there. So this whole area is one of the potentially large sources of hydrocarbons, and I think we ought to go ahead and exploit it, develop a pipeline so we can bring it down and use it.
Well, the truth is we've already drilled there. That's why we know there's oil there. It's like going to the North Pole and finding a Ford fender and a Coors beer can there. We've already been there, and we know there's oil there. We've already drilled there. We've drilled delineation wells. That's why we're pretty sure there's pretty good hydrocarbon deposits up there. And there's absolutely no reason we shouldn't have access to them. Now, my own party is closest to the environmentalists, and so I may not be real popular with some in my own party, but I'm in the 19th district, where I think our folks here in Texas largely understand that. Some places in the United States, the environment is a very delicate thing and needs to be protected. Parts of our world are, you know, cockroach and mosquito territory, and sometimes you almost feel like the best thing you can do is pave it over. But for the most part, we can handle these chores, and we've cleaned up the Gulf of Mexico largely. We've cleaned up our operations. It's not near as bad as it used to be, and in fact, it's, you know, they can do that without further harming the environment. And the landmark should be available if somebody wants to go drilling.
Thank you very much. Our next question comes from Mr. Green.
What would you do to address the issue of the severe water shortage in our area, Mr. Fullingim?
Unaccountably, United States Representative Randy Neugebauer voted against the 2007 Water Resource Development Act. This act was enacted into law over the objections of him and a small handful of other representatives in the Congress, and even our Congress overrode the veto of President Bush. It is now the law of the land, and we have one project from this in the 19th district, and that's the Garden Ridge Reservoir in Shackelford County, which is sort of in the elbow of this big 19th district. What I know going forward is that water is a big issue, and it's on everybody's mind, and the polling that I've had done showed it as a very high priority issue. Almost everyone knows that water is going to be a big problem going forward. Here's what I have to say about that. It's going to require careful coordination between every level of government, and you cannot have the federal government part of it missing like we have our representative missing here tonight. That's going to be the key part of it. But your state government is going to be a big part of it. For example, the farmers in this area are not going going to be able to irrigate on demand, and the state of Texas has already told them that, within the next 5 to 8 years, unless something happens. So we're going to not be a farming region, we're going to be a dairy farming region where we seed it back to grass. That's what's going to happen to this area right here in our district.
I agree with Dwight that we need to worry about conserving our water. I think that we have to worry also about people like Boone Pickens who wants to take water out of the Roberts water fields up north and pump it out of this area and send it down to Dallas. He had some sort of a small commission staffed with his own employees that voted to allow this to happen, and I think we have to worry about not letting people exploit resources on political subterfuge basis. So we need to coordinate the use of water around here. We also need to try to put an adequate price on the water. I'm a little disturbed by just Lubbock where, you know, the water rates are lower for water in your yard because you don't pay the disposal costs than they are if you have your own water altogether. So we know no water rates are going to go up because we have to put in a pipeline from Lake Allen Henry. But prices are one way you raise water. You see people will think twice about using it if the prices are higher to pay for the public expense of trying to gather the water. We also need to try to conserve what we have as well as we can, and the water conservation districts around here need to work with the people in their area to make sure they use water judiciously.
Thank you. Mr. Thornton, final environmental question.
What role does the federal government play in regulating potentially hazardous aspects of the food and agriculture industry, such as genetically modified organisms, pesticides and fertilizers, hormones, etc.?
Well, it depends. As a libertarian, we tend to believe that people commit a crime when they hurt somebody else, and they don't commit a crime when they hurt themselves. So it depends on whether they're going to be hurting someone else with this or not. So one of the problems is what's going to be harmful. I'm not sure that genetically modified seeds are harmful to anybody. And there's not really solid scientific evidence that shows that. So in that case, I'm not concerned. I am concerned about runoffs of pesticides from one person's land into another person's stream from which he waters his livestock. And that's where you're harming someone else. So in terms of regulation, we need to make sure that people do not commit harm on other people by polluting the environment in such a way that they are someone else is harmed other than the person. Somebody only does something that hurts himself, he breathes his own pesticide, well, that's a problem, but I wouldn't consider that a crime. Genetically modified seeds I don't consider a problem unless scientific evidence shows it's a problem, and I've never seen such evidence to this day.
Well, I agree with just about everything Chip said on that. These are common sense kinds of things. There's not a big difference in philosophy, except Democrats are a little more willing to hold corporate feet to the fire. I've spent my whole life in corporate America, and I understand the good that corporations do, but I also understand that if you don't hold their feet to the fire, they'll cut corners and shave costs and do things that are not exactly in the best interests of the public. As far as modified seed and food products and meat that's been where the cattle have been injected with hormones and all that sort of thing, we have a lot to worry about with our exports on that score. Europeans don't like that sort of thing much. For example, they don't like pasteurized milk. They believe you ought to inspect the herd, and when you find a sick cow, not take milk from that cow, but not boil all the milk that you produce. So these are just common sense things, and I will always be willing to be tough on regulations, but understand that people have economic interests, and those need to be accommodated when possible.
We will now move on to the economy and agriculture, which out here in the 19th district pretty much go hand in hand. Mr. Green, you have the first question.
Yes, since agriculture is such a big factor in our region's economy, what would you do to help our local farmers and ranchers?
Well, that's a great question. Our own representative voted against the Farm Bill several times before he finally voted in favor of it. And that's one of the ways that I'm going to be elected. When I go to these farming regions and shake hands with people at livestock shows and county fairs and that sort of thing, people tell me they're very happy to see me and very excited when someone is challenging the incumbent that we have. I think that what was the 2007 Farm Bill included some good protections for farmers and even expanded that to other products that are grown in other parts of the country. So basically, I was pretty happy with it. Not everybody, even in my own party, understands the need for an anti-cyclical farm bill. And what that means is that you have a price support so that it kicks in years when you have low production or you have collapse in farm commodities prices. This protection can step up and keep you from having a massive sell-off of farming assets, which would be devastating for our region to have a lot of farmers going out of business and selling their assets all at one time. That would inevitably impact the business that goes on in town. But that's a big subject and a complicated one, and I think we made a good stab at it. We'll come up again in 2012 when it will be time to renew that. And I want to be sure and make certain that our farmers get the best protection that we can give them.
Well, one of the problems that we had with the last farm bill was not so much involving this region as it was that the pork attached to it was huge for other regions and cities and so forth. And that happens all the time when you're lobbying things through Congress. As a libertarian, of course, I'm opposed to a lot of pork. And that would include if there's excess pork for farmers. I do believe, however, that there is a case that can be made for price support in a critical industry, which is agriculture. And that is because the capital costs are so high. You have to be able to plan to get a return on that investment. So basically what I would propose is we look toward price supports that would adjust as market prices adjust. If the support was set too high, as they often are, and the market price the market overproduced, the price would go down, and we'd adjust the support down automatically by, say, taking a tenth of the difference off the support price until you got it too low. And then if it's too low, you don't produce enough, and the market price goes up, and you adjust the support up. But you do it over a period of like 10 years, so you automatically adjust to current market prices to try to keep production stable, and people could plan to earn a return on their investment and keep on producing in agriculture.
Thank you. Mr. Thornton?
Gentlemen, students, young people our age are somewhat concerned about the solvency of the Social Security program. Describe your views on the Social Security system and what we can do and what you would do as a representative to help create a better environment where people feel better about their Social Security benefits.
Well, the problem with the Social Security program is that actuarially it's about $10 trillion insolvent, and we just don't know that yet because the baby boomers haven't retired yet. And say, oh, we'll put this into the general federal budget, they're going to keep on letting it go that way. But in the long run, it's not sustainable. And so in the long run, we have to look at what caused some of the problems. One of the problems was that Congress kept increasing the benefits and extending them. Another problem was that people have lived longer and healthier lives, so they're living a lot longer from when Social Security was first enacted. By the way, I have my free Social Security book that you can all pick up. I'll give it away there a few years back. So what can you do? One of the things you probably have to adjust the Social Security to the increasing lifespan. So the normal retirement age would go up as the lifespan went up. Another thing is there's this little ratchet adjustment factor in there that goes up with the average wage, what benefits to, and you can adjust that with the consumer price index rather than the average wage. The third thing could be that you would allow people to take their Social Security contributions and put it in private accounts, so the government can't take it away and spend it on federal projects and let people invest in sequestered private accounts, so they could then draw on those accounts when they were older, and it would be their property. They could leave it to the heirs, and they would not have to sacrifice it to some corporate project that the government wanted to spend the money on.
Well, ditto to that. we've got to have the availability of a Social Security program as the underpinning of how we're going to spend our golden years when we retire. I think that he's right when he says it's actuarially unsound, but I think there's another factor at work, and that is I don't think that many people nowadays really want to retire at 65 or 67. I think especially our knowledge workers, the people that are amassed, you might call it knowledge capital, don't want to just, I mean, if you worked in a salt mine or if you worked in a coal mine or something, you longed for the day when you didn't have to go back down underground. But now people go to an office, it's pleasant, they enjoy their work. They're not necessarily going to retire when they're 65 or 67. So that's something, but I agree that you can privatize or allow some people to manage their own portfolio. You might have to be very careful. It would be hard possible to look at that, I think.
Mr. Strong? As we all know, Congress recently passed a $700 billion bailout of the rescue plan. As we've seen over the past 2 weeks or so, not much has really gotten better for the average family, and some experts say that this legislation won't really have any impact on our economy for at least a year. First of all, would you have voted for the rescue plan, and what would you be doing right now if you were currently a member of Congress to ease the economic burden on those individuals in your district?
Well, I went on television and said that while it was very unfortunate that we had to have that rescue plan, that it was in fact indispensable. And for the reason that while it does bail out the banks, we have no other alternative way of handling our money in this economy except through the Federal Reserve System. And so I was in favor of it, and there's more that needs to be done, but it's a little too pessimistic to say that the cure hasn't taken hold yet. We saw the Dow at 900 points today. Those are just day-to-day measures of things, but that was a measure that was encouraging at the very least. But I think the economic stimulus packages that I've heard, the other measures that I've heard that our national candidates are pushing forward, all seem to make some sense to me, and I would join on with some of those for sure. There's more that can be done, but most of people's private lives, their jobs, how they earn their living, what kind of house they buy, where they buy their food, those are all private decisions. And the genius of America has always been private enterprise. It's just often that the government has to create a pathway so that can take place. Even King Solomon had to send his inspectors into the marketplace to make sure that the weights and measurements are fair. This goes well beyond that, but it's indispensable to have the government intervene at certain times. And I was for this, even though I hated that we had to do it. The time to do something about it was 6 years ago when we voted to loosen those regulations that allowed people to get into so many questions and mortgages.
Well, I oppose the idea of handing away $700 billion to Paulson's friends on Wall Street. And especially as the plan was initially proposed, where they would essentially pay more than the securities were worth in a reverse auction. That was just handing money to people who made bad decisions about their own investments. So I was not happy with that. There are better things that could be done to try to address the problems. In 1981 and 2, I was involved in a study of the American financial system when we had the savings and loan crisis. And one of the things that happened then is that some of the savings and loans were able to survive because they had a provision that didn't require marking to market on their securities. They could hold them to maturity. I think that's one thing that needs to be done. You don't mark to market immediately, and you let people hold to maturity. You also have to make sure that credit is available at the local levels by supporting the banks that are making the loans to local business. And in that sense, they are making some improvement, which we reflected in the market today by saying they would support banks who were lending their commercial loans. But lending to other banks, that's questionable.
Thank you. We now move on to the civil liberties issue, and Mr. Thornton with the first question.
On On January 30th, 2008, nearly 1,000 students packed this auditorium to listen to a debate between Steve Hager, High Times magazine editor since 1988, and Bob Sutton, the former DEA agent. The topic was legalization of marijuana. Where do you stand on this issue?
I guess I get the first one. I believe that it's not regulated under the Constitution. It was a stretch to say that the Commerce Clause applies to the regulation of marijuana. I believe it should come under Article 10, or the Amendment number 10 of the Constitution, that says all power is not given explicitly to the federal government or reserved to the states or to the people. California has passed a medical marijuana law that allows people to grow some marijuana for their own consumption, provided they have some medical reason for doing so. And there are medical reasons. One is that it's very good at preventing nausea when you're taking chemotherapy, and another is that it's kind of an anesthesia as well. It has about 3,000 chemicals in it, some of which are beneficial. Of course, the drug companies don't make a lot of money from it. But you've had people in California who've been prosecuted by the federal government who don't even allow people to bring up in their defense that they're complying with state law. And I think that's wrong. I believe that states should regulate the issue rather than the federal government, and I think it's a real stretch to say the federal government has authority in this area. When it, clearly under the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, it should be a state right issue.
I guess one of the benefits of a long life is you see the emergence of an issue and it's dying out, and then it's re-emerging. When I was an undergraduate here, I never heard of marijuana. The only people who knew anything about it were Native Americans who were said to enjoy it occasionally, and when the counterculture grew up, they, of course, adopted it and promoted it and made it a part of youth culture. I went away to the Army in 1966 and came back in 1968, and it was everywhere. It was a felony in Texas to possess any amount. And essentially, what I want to tell you is that I don't care much whether you use it or whether you don't use it, but I know what the sentiment is in the 19th District. And that's the sentiment that I'll vote when I go to Washington.
And Mr. Strong, your question.
Where do you stand on the issue of universal health care in our country? And in your opinion, is health care a right or a privilege?
Well, I don't like to use either one of those words. What it's like is most like the highway system. Right now, every time you say something about having a national health care system, people throw up, oh, we don't want socialized medicine, and I don't want to pay for somebody else's medical care. Well, in fact, you're paying for a lot of other people's medical care, and it's just like saying, I don't want to pay for someone else to get on the highway and go to Amarillo, because I never do go to Amarillo. Well, that's just part of the common part of our society and our living together, is that people, when they get sick, need to have access to health care. And, New England had toll bridges and toll roads, and it stunted their growth for 150 years. And finally, the United States adopted the interstate system, and it opened this country up. People invested in infrastructure. It's really just part of the infrastructure of the United States to have a health care system. We have the doctors and the labs and the nurses and the hospitals and everything we need. What we have is a crisis, now we pay for it. And we Democrats are going to work on that. The Republicans are not going to. They're going to talk about insurance. And it's fine for insurance companies to be involved, but essentially they take about a third of every dollar that's spent on medicine in profits. Profits and operations, I should say, not net profits. But nonetheless, we need a national health system, and we can find one that's still insurance-based, physician-driven, and government-monitored.
I don't think it's necessarily right. It's not in the Constitution. The thing that is in the Constitution is that we should promote general welfare. I think things like the Center for Disease Control and trying to contain inflations epidemics and things of that sort are legitimate. I believe that health care should be provided at the county level, At the state level, and particularly at the county level, I believe everybody should have a county health service. I just got my flu shot last week at ours, but that should provide vaccinations and basic medical services at low or nominal cost to people who need care, basic care. I think if people want more extensive care, they should be able to buy insurance, but nobody should have an insurance policy that pays everything. Everybody should pay at least 1% of whatever they consume. And I think also that all prices should be uniform and posted. Right now, the hospital may charge an uninsured customer 4 times what they charge one with insurance, and I think that's wrong. You can have an insurance policy that covers a higher percentage, but I don't think it's right to have different prices. I think people need to be aware of the pricing of what they're consuming, and I think that would put pressure on the providers to try to keep costs down, because people say, well, this test cost me $1,500, is it worth it? Well, my 1% might be $15, or my 10% would be $150. Maybe it's not worth it. They can make their own decisions, and maybe they wouldn't have as many expensive tests that aren't necessary being conducted.
Thank you. And our final question for this topic is Mr. Green.
What are your thoughts on gun control?
On gun control, I'm not, I believe in the Second Amendment. It means that individuals have the right to keep and bear arms, not this malicious, and that the idea as our country was founded was that governments tended to be despotic at times, and tended to try to exert power over people, and if people had their guns, it would be more difficult for them to do so. So I favor people's right to keep and bear arms. I don't favor the right to go out and terrorize your neighbors with them. But again, this is a libertarian policy that as long as you're not harming someone else, you have the right to do what you please. And therefore, I have no problem with the Second Amendment, and I'm upset with the things like the Washington, D.C. City Council has tried to do to keep people from even having their own guns in their own houses.
Well, I grew up with guns. We had pistols, we had rifles, we had shotguns. And I've always thought, as do most of the voters in the 19th district, and therefore Dwight Fullingim, will also to maintain strong Second Amendment, make no law that tends to ignore Second Amendment protection. However, I had never thought that anyone needed a weapon which was semi-automatic or automatic, so that as long as you held the trigger down and kept fire. To my way of thinking, that ought to always be under the control of a responsible government, and you would always have more firepower in the hands of your police and militia and so on. That way, the idea of people having AK-47s is outrageous to me. That's the only thing. I'll vote my district, though, on gun control.
Thank you. And that is all the questions we have prepared from our panelists, but we have taken some selected questions from the audience. First one is from Gary Bennett. Did you bring the Constitution? If so, hold it up.
No, I didn't bring it. Oh, you got it.
No. Maybe he knows me, and I didn't prepare it.
So it's a good idea.
I quoted it,
Well, it's a good idea. That's the basic document that allows us to live together. I'm sure all of you are aware that our Constitution is a French Enlightenment document. The idea that you could set aside the power of the king and the church was certainly revolutionary in the 18th century. And the idea that you could just dream up the government and describe its various branches and how they were to do their business had not been seen to that extent anywhere on the earth until the Constitution of the United States appeared. And it's been a great document. It's been a great way for us to get along with each other and fight it out. It takes real battles sometimes to figure out what's going on and how we want to proceed. But it served us pretty well, and I have sworn to defend it more than once.
One thing I might say is the Campaign for Liberty has a lot of free constitutions to give away out there. I encourage everybody to take one, because there are a lot of things in there that where people are running roughshod over our rights and don't believe it. I mean, it's the 14th Amendment and also either the 4th or 5th says that you can't take property without due process of law. And there's a lot of confiscation of property arbitrarily these days occurring at various levels. So This is something else that needs to be thought about, and there's lots of violations of rights embodied in the Patriot Act with warrantless searches and the peek and sneak provisions of the Constitution, where they of the Patriot Act, where they can sneak into your house and look at what you have. Clearly says in the Constitution and the Fourth Amendment that you can't search a person's possessions and property without a warrant. You have to have it authorized by a judge.
Speaking of the Patriot Act, Patrick McDonald, a RIM major, restaurant, hotel, management center. If given the opportunity, would you vote to repeal the Patriot Act, and why?
Some parts of it, yes. I mean, I just pointed out some of the objectionable parts. Some parts are necessary because one of the functions of our government is to protect us from terrorists, and some of these provisions may be helpful that way, but some of them also have invaded our individual liberties to a great extent. And actually, I know a lot of people don't like the American Civil Liberty Union, but on this one, I think they're pretty much right on. They've gone through with the Patriot Act and identified a lot of things that conflict with the constitutional rights guaranteed for our people, and I think those provisions should be repealed. There are a lot of things like if a national institution is asked to provide records, they can't tell people they're being investigated, things like that. Secret searches, warrantless searches, sneak and peek, things like that. I think you should have judge's authorization before you do any kind of a search or interception of communications.
That's pretty much the way I feel. I'm not surprised that we overreacted after 9/11 and drew up an act which gave the federal government more power than it should have taken. This happens after every war. Remember the World War II when we rounded up good, solid Japanese citizens and put them in concentration camps in the United States. People will do that. They're scared and they're worried and they'll overreact. But thank God we've always had enough cool head to prevail. At the minute that furor settles down, we have people who can be more reasonable. And when you get rid of habeas corpus, you're going to be in trouble. They're first will round you up because you're a threat. Later on, they'll round you up for another reason, saying that you're a threat. And maybe you get your property, maybe because you caused some member of their family a problem. It could be anything, and they'll use that and play like and pretend that it's national security when in fact it doesn't have anything to do with it. So I'll never vote for anything that suspends habeas corpus, never.
This is from David. What two federal agencies would you eliminate?
Is this for me or for you? Oh, I don't know, get rid of half of them. How about that? In the first 3 weeks I'm in office. I don't know, you have to study those things. There's always the tendency in bureaucracy, as I'm sure I don't have to tell you, is to keep it going because it seemed important when you first started. We've got several review and sunset provisions that allow us to look at all these agencies after a while. We scrap them if they're no longer needed. I didn't bring a laundry list of ones that I would get rid of the first 3 weeks. Or try to get rid of them. You don't get rid of them like yourself. It does take others joining with you in the effort. And when I find one, I'll be the first to go after it because I can use that money. We can use that money for some stuff, some things that we desperately need. We don't need to have a bunch of activities that are non-productive.
Well, it's real easy right now in the current environment. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are two government agencies that recently have been nationalized and doubled our federal debt because we assumed $5.3 trillion in obligations to these institutions that have been making loans to people who can't pay them back. And they knew they couldn't pay them back if they made the loans anyway because they had political pressure on them and they were staffed by political employees. So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac definitely should be shut down. I could go down, I could get in some more, but I think I'll stop with that before I antagonize other people. But I think everybody's going to agree with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac without any difficulty because they're the ones that caused our
monetary savings due to the devaluation of the dollar?
Could you repeat that, please?
Absolutely. Would you support a tax deduction for the depletion of purchasing power of monetary savings due to the devaluation of the dollar?
No. We have indexed tax schedules. Personally, I prefer a flat tax. But the index tax schedules automatically allow for the fact that when prices go up, you don't move into a higher marginal tax bracket because of the increase in price. So when you have devaluation of the dollar, the price levels will go up, and that means you'd be pushed into higher brackets, and we do prevent that to some extent with indexing. Personally, I would rather have a flat tax where you just index the break point where you start paying taxes, have a $20,000 or $30,000 exemption where you don't pay, and then as the value of the dollar goes down, that gets indexed up. So the real tax burden does go up. Because one of the problems is if the government doesn't index the tax base, then as inflation goes up, your taxes go up, and that's a sneaky way to increase people's tax burden.
The answer I have is also no. You're not forced to save money in dollars. You can save money in any currency you want to.
Our final question tonight comes from Ross W. Why should it be my job as a working taxpayer to provide welfare for people without jobs?
Why would it be his job to provide welfare to people without jobs? I imagine people ask that until they themselves are without a job. But I don't have to tell you that in Texas we don't have welfare for able-bodied men and never have had. We have 8 families with dependent children. I guess if you want to watch children starve, that's where you can do that. But you won't have my help on that. I don't know where a question like that comes from. I don't understand it. We now have limits even on that 8 families with dependent children. So that's not the biggest problem we have in the United States is welfare. There are people who think that, and I have friends that think that way. But you know, the poor you always have with you, to quote the Bible.
Oh, I think the only justification would be if you have some sort of insurance program. That's, for instance, when people have jobs, they pay unemployment insurance, or their employer does, and they can draw on that if they're unemployed. Now, you can think of it as a certain amount of social insurance that's justified in certain instances, and I think that's the idea with aid for the families for dependent children. But I think that the best approach is the one that Republicans tried to put in actually a few years back, where you had workfare, that you didn't give welfare unless you also tried to get a job, and you kept the job, and then you could give welfare that would supplement your income. Or a negative income tax where people would get a job, and even if they didn't earn much, they'd get some sort of a payment from the government to give them a living income. So people should be encouraged to work if they're positively able to work, and the welfare should only be viewed as an insurance event in case for some reason beyond their control they can't.
Thank you. And now we will go and close the statement.
Well, I didn't expect to have a closing statement. Well, basically, if you're mad at the Republicans and you're mad at the Democrats and you don't want Nancy Pelosi to have more power, then vote Libertarian, because that shows that you're unhappy with both Republicans and Democrats. And I think Dwight's a nice guy, but he'd have to vote with Nancy Pelosi, and boy, she's got some bad policies, and the Democrats in Congress have some bad policies that I mentioned in my opening statement. So I encourage you to vote Libertarian. The more people who vote Libertarian, the more we will have, more ease we will have in getting people on the ballots in the future. Because one thing that drains the Libertarian Party is having to pay a lot of money to get signatures to get on the ballot every few years. So I encourage you to vote, and I encourage you to vote Libertarian, and therefore vote for me.
Well, here's the deal. You've got a choice. You're the boss. You've got your applicants for this job, 2 of them in front of you. One that he hasn't bought and paid for. You'll be able to decide for yourself who you want to hire for this job. I hope you'll vote realize that you're not sending somebody up there who's going to be an empty suit for Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi comes from a very, very liberal urban district. Obviously, she was sent up there to vote the beliefs and thoughts and feelings of the people who live in San Francisco, not the people who live in Lubbock and Abernathy and Hale Center and Cotton Center and Abilene and Big Spring, the area that I've got. You know, the founders of our Constitution envisioned a representative, the congressman, as being intimately associated with and familiar with what the people in the district wanted. And that's what I'm offering myself to do. Is go, I don't care whether Nancy Pelosi agrees with anything I have to say or not. She's going to need my vote. And she'll have to, if she wants my vote, she'll have to explain why she thinks she ought to get it. But I'm going to vote the way the people, and I think the people in this area want something done about energy. I think they want something done about health care. I think they want things done about the economy. And I'm ready to go up there and do that job. I have a broad background. I'm a West Texas boy with an unusually appropriate resume for this job. And I'm offering myself, and I've got some effort to present the voters in this great big old jumbo district with the choice that they have. And they can make up their own minds and do what they want to do. And I wish Chip would throw the libertarian support. That would be just a little push I need to get over the goal line. For me to get that 2 to 4% along with my 46 that I know I've already got. So, and I think I've got more than that. So I think you're looking at your next Congress. So drop by and see me sometime when you're in Washington. You'll be most welcome.
I want to thank everybody for coming out, especially Chip Peterson and Dwight Fullingim. And I also want to thank our panelists for tonight. That's all the time we have tonight. Drive safe and have a good night.